single school problem. It's a neighborhood issue, and if we attack it as a feeder pattern and not as a single school solution, then we think we have a much greater chance of success. Third is you got to recruit and invest in talent. Autonomy in the hands of incompetent people does not work, right? It's just autonomy. So the autonomy has to be ramped up with the quality of people you have in the building. And in the case of charter schools, or what I like to call autonomous schools, because we have some schools that are charter schools and some schools that we're running ourselves. But in either case, we're talking about autonomous schools, right? And autonomous schools put more pressure on the leadership at the school. It puts more pressure on the principal to be a great leader, a great manager, a great identifier and developer of talent. It puts more pressure on teachers, because if you're going to ask them to work in an autonomous environment, we don't just hand them the script of what you're supposed to teach the next day. They have to unpack the standards, they have to create curriculum, they have to create assessments. And so for this to work, you have to have great people at every level of the organization. And then to me, it's what I talked about earlier. It's taking power out of the hands of bureaucracy, and it's giving it to parents, and it's giving it to educators in the form of choice, right? I get to now choose where I send my kids to school, and as a teacher, I now get to choose where I work. There's not just one employer in town anymore. There's several employers. I can work at Nashville Prep. I can work for Todd. I can work at Liberty. I can work at Lead. I can work at KIPP. If you're a great educator in a city where there's choice and you're good, people are competing for your talent, and that's how it should work. That, I think, is how we elevate respect in the profession. So we talked about being operator agnostic. And then this is the last thing I want to put up. We can get to some of the results, but I know we're running short on time. When we talk about a portfolio school district, if you look in the left, that's what a traditional district office does. Right, I'll give you just a chance to look at that. In a portfolio district, we push autonomy, like I said, down to the school around people, around program, around budget, and around time. And the school acts as the district office acts as more of a support team to support what's happening in the school, not a place where mandates come and teachers get assigned and budgets get created, right? You push that down to the school level, and we become places where we support schools after they've been authorized, and we hold them accountable to results. Like we talked about earlier and what Alex said, you exchange autonomy for accountability, and our job is, once the schools are open, to monitor performance, make sure they have the support they need, agree on the what's, let the schools figure out the how, and then hold them accountable to those results. So in the interest of time, I think I'm going to stop there so we can get to some of the Q&A, but just want to thank you all again for being here today.
Chris, thank you. Right on time. Let me tell you the way we're going to move this program forward. You have heard from 3 individuals that helped us set a context around charters, and nationally, statewide, and certainly locally. We will now have 2 others join us who are running local charters. So Art and Todd, if you'll come join us. This panel will we'll be asking questions for around 30-35 minutes of the panel. At the end of the panel discussion, and by the way, again, these are questions that were prepared with the League of Women Voters, we have a response. And so it's going to be very healthy that you stay and hear that response. And the individual who's giving our response, the bio is on the back, Robert Gowan, and he is serving currently as the government relations representative for the Coalition for Large School Systems. And so we're really appreciative of him being here and giving us an opportunity for a response. After that, we will open it up to your questions, and we'll have approximately 15 minutes for open questions. So if you will hold those until then. Also, this is being taped. And all of the information, as well as the PowerPoints, will be posted on the League of Women Voters site, as well as Lipscomb's College of Ed site. And so if you want to access the materials afterwards, as well as the video, you will be able to do so. All right, so without further ado, let's start with some questions. And we're actually going to start with Todd and Art. Both Todd and Art are here opening some local charter schools here in Nashville. Art's school has already started, and Todd's will be opening here very soon. And so I want to start by asking, one of the premises of the charter school movement is that they add value to school systems. In your opinion, how do district public schools benefit from the practices of charter schools operating within their districts? And Art, let's start with you.
Yes, thank you again for that question. What comes to mind, I have basically 3 ideas. There are really some powerful concepts that large school districts are adopting where they can point to charter schools as saying, these are schools that are doing it. with our population of students. So what do we need to do to also kind of replicate it? The first idea I'd like to talk about is the idea of college access, especially for first-generation college students. That idea, as you go to more and more school districts, this is the idea. We need to get all of our learners ready for college, and they can point to various charter networks, charter schools that are doing it or that have done it with their students. Another thing that we're actually seeing here, specifically here in Nashville, the idea of personalization. One of the things that charter schools do really, really well is personalizing learning with the students. And here, even within Metro Nashville Public Schools, one of the key ideas, the umbrella idea that the district is beginning to promote is this idea of personalization. They can point to very successful charter school networks around the country, here in Nashville, that are doing that very, very well. So it's not an abstract concept. So the idea that a district that has 70,000, 80,000, 100,000 students can say, as a community, we are really going to buy into this idea of personalization. Those are big ideas that have an impact on a lot of people that they can point to the charter school movement. And one last concept that you're beginning to see more and more of is just this idea of blended learning. Nationally, more and more districts are beginning to look at how do we best incorporate technology into the classroom. And the schools that they point to, in a lot of cases, they are very successful charter schools that have already pioneered that movement.
Todd?
Yeah, I would add to that I think these are themes that I think have already been hit on by a few folks up here, but I think autonomy is really important, and I think autonomous school districts, and the district here is talking about moving autonomy to school principals, and one of the things that charter schools obviously have to do well is they have to know how to run autonomous schools well. And so I think one of the practices that charter schools can pass on to the district is how to lead autonomous schools effectively, and that's something that we're excited to do, and I know Art's already doing, and the charter schools here are doing well. The second one that I haven't heard as much is I think there's healthy competition that's really helpful when done in the right way. Is that it was fun. I was at Paragon Mills about a month ago for an event with all charter schools, and all the local districts were there, and all the families were there. And it was pretty cool to see low-income kids walking to 7 or 8 different schools, and all those schools talking to the parents and to those students saying, this is what we can provide to you. This is a choice that you have open to you. And I think even myself sitting at my little booth was listening to other ones and like, oh, that was a good idea. We better up our game a little bit if we want to get these kids. And so I think schools really looking and trying to be great in order to attract kids is healthy for the system. The last one is just innovative practices in general. We do a lot of interesting things with teacher development. We do a lot of work on teacher coaching. There's a lot of pieces that charter schools were meant to be hubs of R&D and innovation, and they should be some place where that happens. And then we need the best districts are going to work with the charter schools to say, how can we scale those things into our current schools?
So this morning I was in Knoxville, Chris, and I heard someone say, this was someone that was representing one of the schools in Knox County Schools, said, what charter schools can't do is provide us with an answer to a systemic problem. And so here's my question for you. Do you feel like charters are the answer to a systemic problem? And in that context, are there charter school models that are scalable that would actually help a systemic issue?
Right. Well, I think the first thing I want to say is that just because a school has charter school at the end of it doesn't mean that it's good or the answer to anything. I mean, there's great charter schools, there's lousy charter schools. There's great district public schools, there's lousy district public schools. And I think what we have to start talking about as a community is outcomes and quality. And let's learn from the best of both, right? Because they both exist. And I think that the answer that charters give is that it's easier for a low-performing school to be replaced or to close. Because, like we said in Alex's first slide, that's the horse trade. It's autonomy for accountability. And so I think charter schools just as by themselves are not an answer to anything. I think if you look at the great schools, right, then I think there are some things we can learn, and I think they are scalable. I think as an R&D lab, like Todd mentioned, I think over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of practices around talent and around human capital that charter schools have nailed in terms of leadership development, how you create teacher pathways for teachers so that they can rise in the profession without feeling like they have to leave the classroom to get a promotion. There's lots of charter schools, lots of networks around the country where you have great teacher pathways, great teacher leadership models that I think districts can learn from. And then I think we're 15, 20 years into the movement now where you've got networks that have scaled to 5, 10, 15, 20,000 students and are doing great and have done it in a way where as they've grown, their quality's gotten better, and as they've grown, the variability from their highest performing school to their lowest performing school over time has been compressed. And I think when you look at what those organizations have in common, none of it's rocket science. They've got good leadership, they've got good management, they've got good systems in place, and once they've invested in people, they've pushed the autonomy that you're going to hear over and over again down to the school level. So I think that yes, it's scalable. Has anyone done it at 50, 80, 100,000 students? No, but I would argue there's not a district that's done it at 80 or 100,000 students either, and maybe trying to do it at 80 or 100,000 students isn't the answer. And so I think as we see more networks grow, in other cities, I hope that it creates more models and more opportunities for those best practices to get shared. Because the last thing I'll say was that was also part of the deal 20 years ago. Charters were supposed to be R&D labs. But what's happened is we've put up walls between traditional public school operators and charter operators, and we're not talking to each other nearly enough. And as a result, I think a lot of those lessons have gotten lost because we're too busy playing defense and pointing fingers and talking about why those results aren't any good, and not enough about talking to each other about what we can learn from one another and how those best results get spread across the entire system.
This question is for Alex from a national perspective, and then Todd and Art from a more local perspective. There's some commentary out there that says that charter schools have underrepresented populations in English language learners and special needs students. And so I want to set that in a context. Is that true nationally and locally? And then secondly, how do charter schools address these student populations? So Alex, I'll start with you.
Sure. Excellent question. In fact, and it gets a lot of hyperbole and vitriolic discussion. Sometimes it's not so based on what's going on in reality. There's nationally in the aggregate, at the big picture, there's a slightly smaller percentage of kids with disabilities in the charter school movement compared to the district school as a whole. And for English language learners, actually they're closer. They're about the same realistically. But more importantly, there's really significant variation. And some places have very low EL, English language learner populations in charters, and some they have considerably more. We also have an interesting set of data coming out showing that we've got markets where the charter schools are actually adding the most value for the most at-risk kids. And so their English language learners and their special ed students are the ones benefiting a lot from high-performing charter schools. But a recent study we worked on at NACSA came out and looked at in New York. And in New York, for example, what they found was, yes, the charters had a little bit smaller percentage of special ed students, but the district schools had a much wider distribution. So there were more district-run non-charter schools with 0 special ed students than there were charter schools. And so we have to understand that the charters are laid on top of a context that's totally, to put it frankly, unfair and inequitable in the distribution of these kids everywhere else and their access to other choices besides charters. And then on top of that, then you're in the charters where there may be a school that's really focused on an EL or special ed population, which frankly will deal with a ton of grief from the advocates for the special ed or EL population. So it's always trickier. As a parent of a kid with disabilities who go to a district-run school, I can say that every interaction I have with the district, there's some sort of discouraging me to exercise choice that the districts do. So it's some people look at this and they say, oh, if there's a difference, it's because the charter schools don't want to serve these kids. It's like, well, the charters are as diverse as districts and district-run schools. Some, that's what they live for. Some want to do it. They don't know how. And there's all these obstacles that exist in our other systems as well. So that's why we at NACSA have helped found actually an initiative on this, a National Center for Special Education in Charter Schools, with ideas to bring together the special education community and the charter community and actually start looking at obstacles on both ends.
Todd?
Yeah, I would add to that I think locally, it first starts with really strong authorization. And I think Alan and Carol, I was very impressed. I wrote charter applications in California, and then applied here to MNPS this year. And I can tell you that they're very, very detailed and paid close attention to the charter school's ability to serve ELL and SPED students well. And I feel like they've done a very, very good job of making sure that schools that are approved are high quality and are able to do that well. And so I think you do see the statistics here are that they are very even in terms of ELL and SPED students being served in local and district schools, especially when you take into account all the statistics that Alex just mentioned. I think charter schools have a huge opportunity to even improve upon that because of the things we talked about with the R&D labs, the ability to have autonomy to try things that are different. For Valor, for example, at Valor, where one of our core values is diversity, and it's something we deeply value. Is we want to have kids with special ed backgrounds and with ELL backgrounds because we think it adds to the richness of the school. And we've placed ourselves on Nolensville Road where we will get a strong ELL population. And so if you want to keep those kids and serve them well, and if they're going to stay at your school, you better do a good job of serving them very, very well. And so it's something that we're really passionate about.
Art, do you want to add?
Yes, and the thing that I'll say that high-quality charter schools do really well is reflect the community that they're in. And so Knowledge Academies, we are in the Antioch Crossings community, which is one of the most diverse communities in the state. And so when you walk into our school, you actually see our community. About 1/3 of our staff, they speak more than one language. Our top two languages are Spanish and Arabic. So when you walk into our schools, you see a very diverse community population. And the reason for that is as a small charter school starting out, you want to do all that you can to connect with the community that you're around. That is just kind of the step one. If we're going to be a successful school, we have to reflect the community that we're around. And at Knowledge Academies, we are doing a very good job of reflecting that cultural diversity.
So we're going to switch gears a little bit to a question that certainly locally we have been engaged in. And so Alex and Alan, I would love for you to comment on this. How do local school boards maintain accountability of charter schools in terms of both legal and fiscal responsibilities as mandated by law?
It's a great question, and like the comment that there's not just good charter schools and bad charter schools, but within districts there's ones that do their authorizing really well and districts that don't do their authorizing very well. They are totally capable of doing this, especially when they oversee 8, 10, or more charter schools. When a district is dealing with its first charter proposal or its second, they're quite likely haven't really thought of it before. And that's when they're more likely to be subject to political pressure, either to say yes or no. And we at NACSA want them to say yes to the ones that will succeed and no to those that won't. And too often they say, because of political pressure that they're subject to, they end up saying yes to schools that technically they should have denied. We find this will be hard for people who've had fights over statewide authorizing versus district, but districts have a higher approval rate percentage-wise than non-district authorizers. But if you get to the larger portfolios by districts, they start looking like any other large authorizer with stronger portfolio management and stronger stuff up front. So we're trying to create situations where districts have the capacity to make a really rigorous decision up front. And that means having resources. We're just in a discussion today with legislators about whether or not the authorizers, including districts, need to have 2 or 3% of the money in order to have the staff that's available to do all the kind of work that Alan's trying to do.
That captures most of it. I'd say that this is really the issue that drove me to this office, and that was experiencing the political situation in the absence of that kind of oversight, which on the one hand was probably overly restrictive and then flipped a switch almost and became overly easy within the span of 1 year. That was what triggered to me the need for rigorous authorizing function and sent me searching for what that would look like, and really led to my being here today and being on this job for the last 4 years. And so Our effort has been to identify those leverage points in the application process, which will give us the best guidance, but also enable us to write good performance contracts, which will enable us to be in a position to execute our oversight when the time comes, and to expand our ability to monitor with transparency and communicate to as many sources as possible how well are these schools doing. And that's taken some time and effort, and we've certainly been we've been greatly supported by NACSA, and a particular grant that we received from NACSA, which enabled us to be able to develop performance management metrics and frameworks in both operations, financial, as well as academic performance, which are beginning to enable us to evaluate and assess the progress and status and opportunities for future growth of schools on a common scale and in a way that is something we communicate to the public and people can begin to become familiar with. And we're on the starting edges of that, but we're very excited about where that's leading us in terms of being able to make real the autonomy for accountability trade. Because the autonomy for accountability trade always makes sense when you're giving autonomy, but it became very difficult in terms of the nuts and bolts and ins and outs of what the accountability was. Now we're in a position where we can define that accountability, and we can actually predict on the front end much better what the likelihood of success in meeting those accountability targets are, and we can intervene, we hope and believe, sooner as a result of knowing that information. And I think this is one of those areas where, as a school district, we're going to get better, because as we try to trade autonomy for accountability in all of our schools, our ability to analyze school progress and to assess what's going on in schools and to predict the likely outcomes of leadership decisions or other choices that are made in the schools will be lessons that will help us to do better with all of the schools that we manage, again, regardless of the label that's on those schools.
So certainly you would say that there is there's a certain level of accountability the school board has once the school has been approved and is now part of that district. They need to be promoting an accountability system that's equitable for all schools, correct?
Yep. Would you like me to elaborate on that just a second?
Just want to make sure. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next question then. Chris, I want you to answer this. There has been a discussion about the inherent conflict of interest for public school boards to approve our public charter schools. And so how can this conflict be mitigated?
Well, first, the district needs to see the charters as part of their district. I mean, these are your schools. So, and these are our kids, and charters are public schools. So I think first, it's just philosophically getting on board with those ideas. I think if you see charters as those guys and those kids and not part of us, then I think you can get caught up in this game that this is a conflict. But like I said, these are our schools. When we authorize a charter school, I don't care if it's a KIPP school or a Green Dot school or a rocket ship school. We talk about them as these are our schools. And I have just as much skin in the game making sure those schools perform as the leaders of that particular school and that charter and the CEO of that network. And so I think if we view schools differently, and it's not us and them, but we, then I don't think there's a conflict. And once the schools are up and running, then I think it's the board's job, like we talked about, to make sure that they're meeting the financial and the academic metrics, and if they're not, to have the courage to replace them. And hats off to MNPS for doing that recently. I mean, those are tough decisions. Most boards back away. Most districts don't take that on, and these guys did, and I don't think they get nearly enough credit for that.
Alex and Alan, I want to ask you